Thank you. So my name is Kostas Panos. I'm the director of CITRIS and the Banato Institute, and I would like to welcome you to what I'm told is the 10th anniversary now of this research exchange. It has been going on for a while, before my time. So during this time, we have hosted a remarkable lineup of technology innovators on the stage, and we're glad to see all of you here today for the Spring 2019 series. Our speaker today, and this was a last-minute substitution, but we are so glad to have Sean to pitch in. He certainly has important things to say. His name is Sean Wihera. He's the development manager of Clarity Movement. He will share his work on distributed sensor networks for next-generation air quality management. And we ask you to not to interrupt the talk and to ask questions. There will be a dedicated Q&A sessions afterward. Now, before I introduce the speaker, I would like to make just one announcement. Next week, March 13th, it's a CITRIS in the CITRIS Research Exchange. We have Associate Professor of Economics Director, Sarah Linardi of University of Pittsburgh, discussing her work on designing applied behavioral research for practical social innovation. So that should be an interesting talk. And now, getting to our speaker, Sean Wihera is the Director of Business Development with Clarity Movement. It is a Berkeley-based startup providing next-generation air quality management solutions to cities around the world. I believe 50 cities by now. It's quite spread. And I would like to say that Clarity Movement was a company incubated in the CITRIS Foundry, so very proud for that. Prior to joining Clarity Movement, Sean was a program manager with the Energy Technologies area of Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, and the founding director of the U.S. Department of Energy's Berkeley Clean Tech University Prize at UC Berkeley. Sean has served as a mentor to dozens of clean tech startups through various programs, including the National Science Foundation iCorp program and CITRIS Foundry. Sean is an active member of the Berkeley Startup Clusters Advisory Group. So Sean, thank you very much, and please welcome.
All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Right through the microphone. Is that good? All right. Well, thank you again for having me. My name is Sean Wihera. I am the Director of Business Development with Clarity Movement. And apologies today, I am not speaking on high-performance computing. We will be talking about distributed networks for air quality management. So as Kostas introduced, Clarity is a Berkeley-based startup. Actually came out of the CITRIS Foundry. And really the team, this was founded in 2014, has set out kind of on this mission to improve the air quality around the world. And we're going to kind of talk through that technology of how we came to provide these solutions, what that solution is, obviously, why this is such a big challenge that we're working on around the world, and then some of our journey in terms of how the company's developed and gotten to where we are today. All right. So briefly, global air pollution crisis. Air pollution is killing millions of people a year prematurely. This is WHO statistics, and it's costing the global economy trillions of dollars in welfare costs. These are often hidden costs as we look at various public health related kind of factors around the world. And the sad part is that today many countries, only about 105 countries, are actually monitoring air quality. So that leaves almost half the countries in the world have zero data currently on their air quality in many of their cities. So what's the problem with air quality management today? And why have we chosen air quality management and sensor networks to address these challenges? Well, if we take San Francisco, for instance, the Bay Area Air Quality Management District operates a single reference measurement point for the entire city. Now, if we know cities and just like this campus or even different buildings, there's actually substantial variations in the levels of particulate matter and nitrogen dioxide, all of the EPA criteria pollutants throughout the city. So as we take an example city where we have several reference monitors, which are effectively these large trailer-sized setups that house expensive regulatory gravimetric measurement and all this different very expensive machinery for monitoring our pollutants, we can only afford and spatially locate so many of these sites. These cost hundreds of thousands of dollars per year, and the Bay Area actually allocates 3/4 of a personnel, of 0.75 FTE, to every single site. So if you think about it, it's not even just the capital costs up front, it's the continuing costs. And we're really going to focus on kind of the operational and the maintenance costs. So that's a key part of how the Clarity kind of model has developed. So as we look, and this is actually that's the Laney College monitor in over in Oakland, actually. So as we look at our reference kind of setups throughout an example city, part of the challenge is that very often we have pollution sources. Obviously we have large sources like the wildfires that come down and affect a whole area. But unfortunately we often have localized pollution sources which are not properly detected and very often just go unnoticed. And while in more developed economies we have source inventories to understand where pollution should and should not be, that's very different than where pollution actually is in many cases. And especially as we look at many of the more developing economies and countries and cities around the world, there's actually very often zero measurement technology to even understand. And further, where we have substantial informal economies, there's often pollution sources that the government is unaware of as well. So quoting Michael Bloomberg, and this quote has frankly been attributed to a number of different speakers as well, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it, and you can't fix it. So one of the interesting choices at Clarity is we actually chose to work with governments. Working with governments is not easy, especially as a startup working on environmental services with a hardware component. But we chose that because, in fact, to address air pollution, the best way is to address the source, frankly. Because at the end of the day, to solve the source, you need to have the authority to do so. So what we wanted to really do is say, how can we improve the ability of today's regulators to better manage basically the air quality challenge and address the sources within our society? So moving from those large regulatory instruments, we have actually moved to small instruments like this. This is our Clarity node, and what this is a small distributed PM2.5 sensor with NO2, does PM10, PM1 as well, and these are completely power and connection independent. These are currently up in 50 cities through 30 countries across 6 continents as of today. So we have been working, I'll block myself there, to deploy these in partnership with the government agencies around the world to supplement and complement the existing regulatory networks. So in comparison with these devices that are the reference setups that they're typically running, these are approximately 1,000th of the cost in many cases, depending on the country that you're deploying these, and even in the most conservative estimates, about 100th of the price on an ongoing cost of ownership basis. So as we start to look at combining the prior air quality management, the way it kind of works, which is effectively we take measurements, which would be the regulatory measurement sites or the distributed sites. We then have to go through an extensive calibration process and quality assurance. Unfortunately, like any measurement instrument, as many of you know, requires extensive calibration and then even tuning. So as we look at particulate matter around the world, in fact, it's very different based on the source compositions and basically the profile of pollution. And in fact, that changes. So for instance, what we're typically monitoring in the Bay Area is in fact very different than the sources that come through during a wildfire, for instance. So how we can tune and adapt our measurement technologies to provide an absolute measurement that actually corresponds to something we can use for exposure estimates, for policies, is really quite an expensive challenge if you think about it, and often time consuming as well. So finally, we move from measurement to quality assurance to analysis, where we then do our economic studies, our reporting, our exposure studies. And unfortunately, by the end of this often takes weeks, if not months in some cases, to come up with the analysis. And at that point, determining whether we can improve our actions, our policies, or actuate a system like an HVAC control within a building.
Excuse me?
Yes?
You started out projecting very well, but you're declining.
All right, I will do my best to speak up a little bit, and if I speak too quickly, please let me know. I have a tendency to over-caffeinate, so. Yeah, let me move it up here a little bit. A little better? All right, make sure I don't start feedbacking. So what we've done at Clarity is actually combine all of this. So what we've taken is we've moved from, and the pricing model is one of the fun parts of a startup, we've moved to a sensing as a service model, where we partner with cities at a fixed cost for multi-year contracts, provide a combination of the hardware, all of the QA, QC on the data, the quality assurance and quality control, as well as the deployment and all of the analysis. And what this helps us do is not only cost effectively provide huge orders of magnitude more data, but one of the challenges that many air quality management agencies, and going back to our concerns around the ongoing operational cost, is around the world we find that reference equipment, and this happened during the past wildfires as well, falls out of service. People do not budget appropriately for the variable maintenance costs and the operational ongoing costs. And we see this especially throughout less rich countries and economies around the world. So what we now are able to do is say for 5 years, we can ensure you get your data, QA, QC, as well as all the analysis and insights at a very fixed, fastened price. And this takes a lot of the risk out of these investments in this technology. And in many cases, they didn't even have any reference measurements to start with. So taking a step forward, what this looks like in process is we distribute and deploy a network of Clarity nodes, and these are static monitors, as I showed you, throughout the city, where we work very carefully to understand what are the pollution concerns within a city, and that actually varies. So if you take London, for instance, currently nitrogen dioxide is one of their primary challenges, and diesel particulate matter. But where and how you site these monitors is really unique to the pollution challenges of each city, which at the end of the day, air pollution is a fluid dynamic equation. So something like particulate matter, which may disperse and distribute over hundreds of meters, you take NO2 in comparison, and it can disperse over 5 to 10 meters. The height and exposure for an adult to a child varies. So we work very carefully with our city partners to design and develop these networks in ways that's really unique for them, so a very high-touch approach. At that point, deploying the monitors takes about 5 or 10 minutes, and we'll talk about that per piece. So in contrast with days or weeks, I can set these up with basic hand tools and a cell phone and get real-time data starting to stream in about 5 minutes. From there, all of the raw data, so temperature, humidity, particulate matter, nitrogen dioxide, battery levels, solar panels, every bit of operating data that we can pull off that device, we push up to our cloud. Now, this is obviously, and we can talk about some of the challenges in terms of new technology approaches. It's not uncommon where technology outpaces the development of policy. Things like cybersecurity and cloud-based data protocols vary from country to country. But what this allows us to do is very leanly and very scalably take raw sensor data, push it up to the cloud where we collect all the data, and then through machine learning, sensor fusion, and a huge amount of quote, corrections and co-location studies established with the regulatory equipment, correct that data to make it regionally and source appropriate for each city. So again, in terms of the communication, the hardware, we typically use global cellular. So we take a SIM chip that has a partnership with telcos all over the world. So I can take this same device and deploy it in 180 different countries, and it just connects to the local network. And because when we look at these kind of costs, it's the things like deployment, all these hidden costs of distributing sensor networks, really we had to work around for the business model. Because at the end of the day, if you have we have to really work around the operational costs of working in a city. So for instance, the deployment costs can often be tens, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars for truck rolls, or when service technicians have to drive out to equipment, is very expensive on an hourly basis, as well as in terms of routine maintenance for traditional systems. So we really wanted to build something that we could deploy and not touch any more than once a year. And the idea is that all of the diagnostics, all of the calibration, all of the reporting could be completely hands-free and wireless. Because if the city is driving out to these devices, it's simply infeasible at that point. And as an example of that, San Joaquin Valley's Air Pollution Control District, who we work with as well, 35% of their staff time is currently just spent driving between sites, which when you think about the cost on an hourly basis for expertise, technical expertise in air quality technicians, it would be better spent analyzing air quality data than driving from site to site. So finally, we take our raw data, we correct all of this data from the easily but uniquely deployed networks in partnership with each city. We push it up to the cloud where we correct the data using correction coefficients established with our government partners. Obviously there's a bunch of cybersecurity that goes into that, and we won't touch on that for now. And then there's this intelligent data correction. And we're going to dive into our smart calibration process a little bit more, which is how we can leanly and very scalably provide these low-cost sensor measurements and make them very comparable, and in some cases even higher performing than the regulatory monitors in certain environments. And then finally, with all of this data, when we go from having 2 or 1 measurement sites per city to 100 measurement sites, all of a sudden reporting not on an hourly or once every 24-hour basis, but we can have data coming in 5-minute intervals in real time. The ability to look at the effectiveness of policies, procurements like zero-emission fleets, and a whole variety of different urban use cases, which the part of the fun for me is many of these use cases have not even been explored yet. So I'm working with numerous partners always saying, how can we use this air quality data for HVAC controls, traffic light timing, all around the world on pilots. So real quick, briefly, the hardware is actually surprisingly simple. And as we said, hardware is typically not where you want to be when you're a startup these days. It's easily commodified. Somebody in China will manufacture a very similar device. But one of the keys for us is that it's measurement technology. So the precision of device-to-device consistency is really a key enabler for us in terms of how we can actually apply our smart calibration techniques. So within the device, we have obviously modular communication, cellular Wi-Fi. We're also working with narrowband IoT providers as well as LoRa, so some of these new generation connectivity protocols. And then we include a variety of low-cost sensor components. These are optical particle counters, or OPCs, which are used for particulate matter. We are actually counting particles of various sizes of 1 micron, 2.5 microns, or 10 microns in diameter, and electrochemical sensors for NO2 and other gases. We then also, of course, one of the challenges, of course, is in the deployment process, it's very expensive not only to deploy, but to hire electricians or certified electricians to power. So the solar and battery combination allows us to avoid a lot of the costs effectively associated with traditional sensor deployments and some of our competing technologies. So we can deploy, again, these in about 5 minutes around the world. And the idea, of course, is that it's in a very durable, weatherproof shell. So in contrast with the traditional laboratory technologies, we've been trying to find the right blend between something that is IoT and very environmentally kind of resilient, the ease of use associated with IoT technologies today, but can perform something comparable, if not parallel, with those of regulatory equipment that has extreme kind of operating sensitivities, et cetera. So, and there's a bunch of other things like the battery sizing, for instance. How can you ensure that through snow, through monsoons, through hurricanes, that these devices keep operating and you don't lose an entire network because of one environmental event? So as I mentioned, one of the key differentiators and one of the most exciting parts, and I apologize, I didn't quite have time to redo all of my slides today given the quick turnaround and shift on speakers. But what we want to talk about and what really drove me to join Clarity was actually the software calibration process. How can you scalably take low-cost technology and then adapt it in a way that can provide comparable data to regulatory equipment at the lowest possible cost? So what we have here, this is the deployment process for most competing, if not traditional, low-cost sensors, where typically we take a reference site, like this red dot on the left, Mexico City, and if you were using other devices, you would take all of your devices, 10, 20, 100 devices, and keeping in mind those deployment costs, you locate them near the reference monitor, you come up with a calibration, you effectively zero them as close as possible or mate them as close as possible to the reference monitor. You then redeploy your network, a second deployment cost, which is very costly, and then afterwards, you would then understand what that correction coefficient is from a short period of time, which of course has challenges in terms of capturing seasonality and other kind of variations in the profile. And then you apply that to the data set, and after that, you begin to work with analysis, sometimes 6 months, sometimes a year later in many cases.
Question?
Yes?
Why do you need that calibration? Are the measurements not sort of absolute enough?
So the problem is that actually particulate matter refers to PM 2.5, refers to a particle size, not a composition. So the challenge is that there is no standard for low-cost sensors. PM 2.5, of course, refers to particles, and if you look at that in Mexico City, is very different than the Netherlands than Southeast Asia. So as we have to understand what is the distribution of particles, particle sizes, and then composition, because of course as we look at cube function of this, the current standards for particulate matter are in concentrations, and it's a great question, are in concentrations or weights. And because we're using low-cost optical particle counters, we have to move from a counting principle to a gravimetric or a weight-based comparison. So it's very important to understand effectively how we can best convert that count to a concentration. And that has to be understood through the comparison with the regulatory gravimetric methods. So one of the first things that, of course, we did in 2017 flew about 200,000 miles setting up co-location studies. And we'll talk about that a little bit further in a moment. So what we actually do, and part of the reason, again, we keep a hand in hardware, is because device-to-device consistency is about 99.98% from the factory, where we zero everything and do a very intensive laboratory calibration with our contract manufacturer. Now, we do that using a standard PM 2.5 testing dust, which is called Arizona road dust, which is great if you're in Arizona, but if you're in Bangkok, it's not very helpful. So, of course, we get the devices as zeroed as closely as possible, but with the knowledge of how precise the devices are from one to the other. Instead of doing 2 deployments, as we previously saw with other technologies, we can actually deploy our network in one go. yellow wire here. And what this allows us to do is we set up a co-location as well with one, if not more, regulatory monitors, typically in duplicate or triplicate, which is the new standard for the EPA. And we begin collecting all of that raw pre-processed data. Now, because we've been doing this around the world, we have a sense of correction coefficients, and of course there's compensation for humidity, temperature, which is really key. But we can actually start to apply corrections over the whole network as quickly as possible. And the idea is all of the raw data feeding up into our cloud allows us to then adapt that in real time. There's no second deployment. You can improve your corrections over time, and you can also adjust to things like seasonality, where, for instance, in San Joaquin Valley, you have 4 unique particle seasons throughout the year. You have the harvest season, you have the basically biomass burning season, as they call it, which is when everybody's burning their stuff at the end of the year. So your source profile is actually shifting, and how that distribution, that compensation between counts and concentrations needs to be adapted and updated. And this allows us to very nimbly adjust, or for instance, when the wildfires come in, soft pine profile primarily is actually different than what many communities are exposed to. So this allows us to very nimbly correct that data in real time in some cases. It depends on our customer's preference, and adapt that. Similarly, you see things like you'll hear about the Saharan dust storms blowing into London. Well, unfortunately, that requires a huge recalibration because, in fact, all of those particulates are completely different than what you would be expecting for your routine profile. So again, this allows us, and combined with, you can imagine, with the networks that we have around the world, the amount of kind of machine and global learning we're doing in terms of profiles, how we can best adjust to provide something comparable to the absolute measurement of today's reference technologies. So as a kind of example of what this looks like in terms of the slope offset, we are exploring kind of dynamic calibrations in addition to linear calibrations. I'll take an example here where this is actually, again, you can see in the bottom right, another one of these reference setups and our devices where we're actually putting them as close as possible together. We refer to these as collocation studies. Now the problem is, like purple airs and all these other optical particle counters, assuming they've been calibrated for Arizona road dust, you actually find significant offsets. And this is example data from the comparison with a reference. The reference is actually the orange line, and the blue line is actually our sensors without the calibration established. And you can see it's generally tracking the data, but you can tell there's an offset, a significant offset in terms of the absolute measurement. And we hear about this a lot in terms of purple air monitors are overestimating and all of these kind of challenges. I love what purple air is doing, and these guys, I don't mean to talk poorly about them. They're really leading the field in low cost, and it's 2 guys in a garage doing a great thing for the world. But the challenge is, if you want to start making exposure estimates, policies, we need to move up in terms of absolute measurement accuracy. So after we establish correction coefficients, we can actually, again, take a $1,000 device, and you can begin to get much closer to reference technologies. Now this is, of course, in a very humid environment in Southeast Asia, which is the true challenge for all optical particle counters, as well as electrochemical. And likewise, this here is, again, our Laney College deployment, where you can see, actually, we've got the devices literally on the handrails. You can even see them from the freeway if you're on 880, 980 as you're going by the monitor, where we're actually comparing. You can see it's actually closer in the Bay Area, where it's a drier environment typically. Obviously, we get fog fluctuations, et cetera. But after correcting, the data gets very, very close. And that's really the key for us, is how close do you need to be? And this is a challenge, again, that we don't have standards in terms of what the performance needs to be for low-cost sensors. And it really depends on your application in many cases. So as we jump forward, and I mentioned, spent a lot of time about 2 years ago flying around to establish these studies. And the key is that everybody needs to do their own study at the end of the day. Paris is going to be different than Spain. Spain is going to be different than Kenya. Very different. And long story short, and this is Mexico City, actually, getting individual validations and performance reviews with every single country. Now the thing is that as we're waiting for contracts to develop, one of the key challenges selling to business to government is, of course, governments have never bought this stuff before. And if we know that about cities and governments, they're not very good at buying things always in the first place, especially not technologies they don't necessarily understand and stuff they've never seen. So one of our kind of keys, and we'll talk about this in terms of how we've been developing our business model a little bit later, is we set up these co-location studies and begin to do these low deployments, which fall under the tender requirements. And this allows us to demonstrate a year's worth of data as we argue and lobby for effectively a following budget the following year to scale these projects up. So it's actually kind of going wide and not tall, which is very interesting. We obviously focus on a number of kind of strategic partners, so typically capital cities, whether it's Singapore, Mexico City, Paris, Milan, and then from there it's much easier after I'm deployed in Paris to move down into other smaller cities, so to speak. Really a question of credibility. Yeah.
Is that an AOT sensor sitting on top of yours?
That is not my sensor. It may be. I couldn't tell you though, to be honest. Yeah, no problem. So yeah, doing this all around the world and trying to introduce the technologies to the authorities. So moving forward, and we'll come back to a little bit more of that in a bit, is some of the tools that we've built. So again, in terms of keeping with the kind of IoT mindset and culture, we wanted to make it as easy as possible, not take weeks to get these things set up. But for instance, if we have a wildfire, can we deploy these without Wi-Fi, without power constraints? Can I put up a network of 20 to 50 sensors in one day? Yes. And the idea is that, yes, I typically use my cell phone where we take the device and you can scan a QR code, which brings you into a format like this. It's about one page you have to fill out in terms of where the device is, the height, indoor, outdoor, and then you log it. Assuming the device is powered and has cell connectivity, it is immediately starts streaming data to our cloud. So again, in terms of responsiveness to events, this has allowed us to be extremely nimble in saying, hey, certain communities need data. They may not even have power because the power lines have been wiped out by a wildfire, for instance. Cell towers may not, but in many cases, this has allowed us to provide applications in urgent situations much more quickly. So as an example, too, of some of the visualization, some of our other tools, during the wildfire, we were heavily promoting our open map, which really consumer applications is not my focus. Primarily right now, we are working through government and B2B relationships. However, we do provide, similar to like Purple Air, and I keep referencing that, so probably the most common consumer air quality monitor, kind of a map which combines all of the available reference data throughout Europe, North America, as well as the small number of nodes that we're allowed to make public. Unfortunately, most governments, my data is under non-disclosure and they don't share that data but use it to support through their own visualization tools. So in fact, visualizations like this are not our largest priority, but in terms of how we feed that data to the EPA's Air Now program or ESA's models in terms of their air quality forecasts, et cetera, which is kind of key in terms of where we fit in the kind of the business stack, so to speak, of air quality. Additionally, at the top, you can see a little bit, this is a simple web app tool that we use. It allows you to kind of look at time series data, spatial comparisons, kind of visualize your network. So it is kind of an intermediate layer. We are expanding that and building in some very cool analytical tools over the next kind of couple months to a year. And then likewise, we often use our data to pump into the kind of stuff that the EPA or Singapore's NEA or kind of the government authorities or smart city dashboards would be providing. So how we can cross this air quality data with transportation data, it's typically a level beyond what we do, but we make that all very easy to access through API, WebSocket, any sort of kind of data feeds. So as we come back to our example of what this looks like in a city, and we saw this earlier example of how we have reference stations and pollution sources, we take an example 50 node network where we have pollution. And suddenly, it becomes much easier to understand where, how, and who is being affected by these events. And in many cases, you might find we may even have another pollution source where we're unaware of, whether it's Bongo Burger or whoever it happens to be. And this allows us to much more accurately improve our policies, assess the effectiveness of these policies. So for instance, if we take the city of Paris, famously along the Ile-de-France near the Notre Dame Cathedral, it's a very high trafficked area for tourists, and there's a lot of concerns in terms of the NO2 and the PM2.5. Now, because of partly the aesthetics in Paris and partly the spatial allocations, fortunately, all the reference monitors are not near that area in the first place. And second of all, they're on the roofs of buildings, which is not representative of the exposure to the people on the ground. Now, famously in 2015, they actually shut down the area to all of the vehicular traffic to see if it would have an impact. Now, the problem was, first, none of the monitors were close enough. Second, none of the monitors were at street level. And third, after 4 days, and then 4 days of a policy of shutting down the roads, weeks later, they determined it actually had zero impact on the air quality exposures at a cost of about, it was 12 to 15 million euros of economic activity over 4 days. it would have been awfully nice to see on day one that you were not having an impact to that policy. So we are actually now deployed in Paris and scaling up rapidly. So all along the Champs-Élysées and in the northwestern arrondissements, and we'll be finishing the rest of the city probably by the end of this year, which is quite exciting in terms of real-time policy. You will not be able to see our individual monitors, but in terms of the policies and how Air Paris chooses to work with that data will be very exciting. So one of the other questions I wanted to touch on, a lot of people ask us about mobile monitoring. So why are you not driving around in a car? Isn't that more effective than basically putting these things up physically? Well, actually, they're kind of two complementary approaches. One is, of course, we have our stationary networks, and there's challenges and costs associated with municipal works and permitting and certifications, all the banes of my existence. Second, you can have much more expensive equipment on mobile platforms. However, one of the problems you run into is as you move around, you don't necessarily know where the pollution is. So for mapping certain areas and for measuring more exotic compounds with more expensive equipment, I think it's a very interesting complementary approach. But you've got to keep in mind that air quality is a number of different pieces, and there's really no silver bullet, including clarity for this. And it's a key of how we work with the regulatory instruments, how we work with distributed sensor networks, as well as mobile monitoring components. Combine these to provide truly next generation air quality management. So a couple of our use cases, as I mentioned, we're in Paris. We're currently in Cupertino. We just run AB 617. It's an assembly bill that was passed by California previously to improve community air monitoring, where we're currently, as I mentioned, improving kind of the local air data within Paris. Cupertino, you may, if you've been down there, obviously everyone knows about the Apple facility, but to the southwest of Cupertino is actually the Lehigh Quarry. And for a long time, there's been a challenge in Cupertino with dust, et cetera, basically transport within the kind of Cupertino neighborhood. So we're trying to basically have a light network fence line as well as community monitoring to help understand what could be coming from the quarry and what is also just ambient and representative of the Bay Area's averages. And then finally, we're putting 50 monitors actually in Richmond, California. Keep in mind, San Francisco has a single measurement point. 50 monitors to really do a lot more impact studies and epidemiological research. And this is in partnership with Groundwork Richmond, Ramble, ARB, and a number of other partners within Richmond to really improve the level of data access to understand what the emissions within Richmond are really impacting and costing us. So another example is kind of policy assessments, where, as I mentioned, you have low emission zones coming in where people shut down streets, may or may not have an effectiveness. I always like to see my little PowerPoint animations here. We have our standard kind of ambient air quality. But the problem is, as we said, we don't necessarily know if the air quality is maintaining itself or if it's getting better. And this becomes a very easy way, as I demonstrated, to see the effectiveness of your policy in real time and do things like A/B testing. If I'm going to invest in electric buses to improve the air quality, I can begin to actually compare electric and diesel bus routes in real time, have the networks deployed, commission the electric buses, and then begin to actually measure the changes compared to the baseline that we've had before. We can take then, the exciting part is, of course, we're not trying to sell morality at the end of the day. We're trying to demonstrate that air quality is, in fact, an economic investment for numerous reasons. But the idea is we can take WHO, regional, national economic factors in terms of pollution exposures and shrink those down to the scale at which cities can actually legislate policies and actually buy things. And the idea is that right now you can take the cost comparability of an electric and diesel bus, and guess what, they're pretty expensive. But if all of a sudden we can say over the 15-year life of a bus and the reductions in particulate matter based on, or NO2 as well, based on the routes that it's traveling, those economics actually start to look a lot better.
A question on the previous slide. What are you monitoring at the refinery? Most of what's of concern that comes out of there is hydrocarbons.
Yeah. So that's one of the keys too, is that we can't monitor everything. So clarity, we've really taken a line where, unfortunately, low-cost components, for instance, for SO2, H2S, some of the hydrocarbons, et cetera, they're simply not good enough for us to adopt. So PM sensing and NO2 are pretty good, as is ozone right now, but ozone is typically more diffuse. We have elected, there's a lot of competitors that buy every sensor available, stick it in a big white box, and then they say they provide everything. But the problem is you'll never see an evaluation or performance result for it, and the performance, the correlation is often 0.2 to 0.4 to a regulatory instrument. So it's not very useful for these things apart from answering RFPs in some cases. So we've chosen to go with PM and NO2 at this time because that represents a significant kind of market segment for us. It helps with a lot of the data, but as I mentioned, we still have a place for regulatory monitors. There's no silver bullet. And some of these applications, SO2 for instance, we're just not in a place to suit that just yet. So a couple other policy examples. We work with UN Environment as well as UN Habitat. We did one example in Kuala Lumpur as part of the World Urban Forum 9 a year ago, or whatever that was, where we actually set up a network, and those guys were amazing. We got it up in one day. We met with them at 10:30 in the morning. I'm not even kidding you. At 12 o'clock, I had 2 police cars and 3 bucket trucks, and we were out putting up a network. I mean, if you told me that would have happened, I would have laughed at you. But yes, truly in one day, we got a network set up for this event. And the idea was to monitor a route where they shut the cars for bikes only once every 2 weeks. The problem is that given the amount of traffic, we found that their bike-only pathway or bike-only route was actually having basically no impact on the air quality. Because of course, we call it the Waze effect. You're just moving the transportation elsewhere. The incentives were not there not to drive. It was nice for the bike riders. However, the overall volume of the traffic was not effective. So let's reconsider how we can develop policies or city interventions that are more effective. And then likewise, we're actually working with SEDIMA on a number of programs, which is Mexico City, and we're even helping them cite where their reference monitors should go at this point, where we can say, spatially, we have a better picture of their city than they do in some ways. And how can we best inform and say, what is a representative location to install these very expensive monitors? So as we look at the business model, it's bounced around a little bit from hardware plus a subscription. This year we said, know what? We're going to go completely service, sensing as a service. So we've just made it easy. Your choice of hardware, whether that's externally powered or solar battery powered, the Node S, and provide everything up to kind of insights and additional analysis for $1,000 a measurement point per year. And when I can give you a clean-cut number like that for a 5-year contract, 200 nodes, looks great for us because everything goes in that recurring revenue column, which the investors like to see, and it also works great for our customers because at that point, for them, all the guesswork's taken out. What happens if a device goes down? What happens if yada? It's all covered completely at that point. And again, if you say 200 nodes over 5 years, that's $1 million. Well, guess what? That's the price of one of your regulatory stations over 5 years. So it starts to look pretty darn good. And as again, I mentioned, one of the challenges in B2G sales or business to government sales is, of course, governments can't allocate funding rapidly without competitive bids, without RFPs, and there's typically a challenge in how we can scale these deployments. So what we typically do is, of course, we get leads through a whole variety of sources, and we've overcome some of the credibility issues of being a startup by working with really cool, exciting partners. Where we start, we get our leads, and as I mentioned, we go establish these demos. These are typically co-locations of 10 devices at a time or so, where we get the kind of the devices down, we're demonstrating the accuracy of the devices, and most of the agencies these days are familiar with the technology and have an interest, but we need to de-risk it for them further. From there, we can start moving and finding funding pools within the government or through academic partnerships or third parties like Bloomberg Philanthropies, whoever it happens to be, and use these to scale these up and continually de-risk through this scaled tiering process. And this gives us a time to continue to work with the environmental agency to put in the budget requests or help develop the RFP. And again, it's really hard to write a RFP as a city to purchase equipment that you've never bought before and that there are no standards for. So this is a patience game in many ways to sell to government. And of course, we are working with businesses as well. But some of the partners, we got very lucky early on in terms of distribution relationships that we're still 14 people. My whole company, 14 people with 50 cities, is working through distributions and partners. So for instance, working at the 14,000 sales employees at Cisco has made my job a lot easier. And likewise, Suez Sonoma Technology, who's like the EPA's longest running contractor, they developed the whole AirNow system. Ramble, who has developed most of the environmental models that cities and governments are using today, CAMX, et cetera. And then a lot of kind of third-party NGOs and nonprofits, the World Bank, Clean Air Asia, UN Environment, UN Habitat, et cetera. And these are all relationships that we've developed along the way or from people I've met while working here at the university or at the National Lab, et cetera. So what does this journey kind of look like? And I think this is really a kind of a fun slide for us, is that it was actually 2014 when I was working here that we, the CITRIS Foundry provided in partnership with, at the time, a group called the Energy and Climate Institute, $10,000 to Clarity. It was to like a 19 and a 20-year-old, $10,000, who'd have thought? And sure enough, the team kept going. And what they did first was actually develop a sensor component, PM2.5 optical particle counter. They knew they wanted to address air quality, but they didn't know exactly how. And I think that we always talk about the pivots and the journey, and this is a great example of that, where this team of kids, as we all joke about ourselves, developed this new sensor component, but realized after developing and then licensing that to a Swiss sensor manufacturer that we really didn't want to be involved in the components. We wanted to have a more direct impact on air quality. Where we then took some of those components and other components and started to combine those in the platform that I've got here today. So I joined the company in 2017 to help lead the launch of the business after developing the hardware and solution as it exists today. So joining, we went from we had a small network up in Berkeley and Mexico City in April of 2017. And then since then, it has just been explosive traction, where we've been working through a variety of distribution partners and leveraging these relationships to the point that we're at today, which again is over 50 cities and over 30 countries. And this is selling hardware as well as software to government agencies. And that's been through a huge amount of partnerships, and I can't emphasize that enough, because frankly, Clarity showing up in the city of Paris, and they're like, who are you? But after you begin to say, yeah, well, we're actually a price list partner for Cisco and the United Nations, and it's a question of de-risking this for our team, and that's been a really successful strategy for us.
How many sensors do you have deployed in those 50 cities?
So it depends from city to city, but we're in the thousands of sensors right now, and by the end of this year, we will have more sensors deployed than any other company in the world. So an example of some of the other partners that we're working with, and I think it's really key that even with 14 people, you have to be thinking, the vision, the scale, the leanness. And obviously we have our distribution partners, we have other strategic alliances that we've been working on, technology partners. So as I said, we actually had a very big hand in developing sensor components. So rather than just taking a bunch of off-the-shelf components, sticking them in a box, we actually work very closely with our sensor providers to actually squeeze the performance out of those things, working not just with the digital outputs, but the analog signals, figuring out ways that we can reduce the EMI and a whole bunch of the electromagnetic interference and a bunch of these other kind of challenges associated with the sensors, which comes back to that kind of precision and consistency that we're really striving for in terms of the highest level of quality that we can provide. And then finally, with other research partners that, coming from Berkeley, and I always say this is like where I started my career, is working with third parties to support research interests. So we're currently working with 5, if not 6 of the UCs. We're trying to get into all of the UCs at this point, and helping support publications and the kind of research. So in fact, you all can do this research far better than I can, and really at the end of the day, we're trying to provide the best possible data for the best possible use cases. And we realize where our role starts and ends. So I'm very keen to, of course, continue, and we're working with some of the best academics all around the world. Just briefly looking at some of the kind of coverage. As we mentioned, 50 cities, 30 countries. They're not all listed here because of some disclosure issues. And we're on 6 continents right now, which I can assure you makes time zones very challenging. And we are trying to get Antarctica just for fun. So yeah. And then finally, I think this is one of the most important slides. It's your team. At the end of the day, all of this would not be possible without a team of just truly amazing people. We've lost a couple of these people. So Christelle, my business development intern, actually recently launched her own company, which just got funded significantly. But it's a very small, lean team that's actually doing this. We're in the process of expanding that. But again, I can't emphasize enough that company culture, and a lot of this came from Berkeley. Everybody on this team has been here to make a difference. It's not about making money. It really comes back to the core of CITRIS, which is this is technology research in the interest of society. We're here and we're working in clean tech. We're working in environment because guess what? It's air pollution. It's a problem that needs to be solved. And that's something that I really just can't emphasize enough about kind of the value of CITRIS and kind of the foundry and what's going on here. So with that, it's clarity. We come back to this, and we always say if you can't measure it, you can't manage it, you can't fix it. We actually say if you can measure it, you can manage it, and you can fix it. So with that, thank you very much, and I'd be happy to take Q&A. How are we doing on time? Oh, look at that. Perfect.
So great, now that we have the data gathering solved essentially, I was wondering whether you have any information of how many of these institutions and governments actually do something serious with that data, not just a study to figure out where it might be coming from, but actually make a policy change that really has some bite? Because that's the really hard problem now.
Yes, that's actually a great question, and that really varies from city to city. And what we're trying to do, and of course for me, coming from the energy world, you know, energy efficiency is an easy sell because you save energy, you save money. It's the economics that drive this stuff all around the world. So we're really working to develop the case studies, particularly around economics, for transportation, urban planning. I'm working on studies where we're looking at what's the appropriate offset from a road to residential planning policy. So again, how can we combine, you know, because of course at the end of the day, they want to use as much land as possible. It's a money issue. So can we convince them to have a further offset for where they build their buildings, probably smaller units, to improve the health outcomes and reduce the health costs associated with these things? So it's really a challenge and a slow process. The example of AB 617, which is this California Assembly bill, Eric Stevenson, the director at the Bay Area Air Quality Management District, you know, he got asked this question recently and said, okay, from getting selected as a community for AB 617, getting a network deployed, to something changing in terms of policy or action, how long does that take? And the sad part was, he said, for getting selected to breathe in clean air, no faster than 5 years. So really, unfortunately, we're trying to find ways that we can improve that. And of course, working in the indoor environment and some of these other options, and working with private groups such as campuses or public groups such as campuses, we have a little faster runway in some cases to actually get to meaningful exposure reductions.
So it was only 4 months ago that we had this appalling smoke episode in the Bay Area, and we shut down the big game. And I had some things to do during that period, and just getting around, I felt like I was cutting weeks, maybe years off my life, just trying to do anything at all. So is anything known about what the health effects were of that episode? For example, just measuring in how many person months of life were lost.
Yeah, so there will be, I'm sure, a lot of analysis coming out on that. So after you cross the 100 microgram per cubic meter average, you see an extreme acceleration in emergency room visits and costs effectively associated with that. They, again, will take those WHO exposure factors, and chances are somebody at the university, the lab, or another university will boil those into an economic kind of a calculus in terms of both cost as well as human years that you were exposed to, the human cost, life cost, so to speak. The forest fires were really interesting, and we, of course, are actually funded right now through a CITRIS seed-funded project working with the Center for the Built Environment. We were additionally looking at ways, of course, we can reduce exposures, and of course, the indoor versus outdoor environment, campus was closed, but what we are finding, and I can't show you the results from that yet, is that in many cases it would have been safer to keep certain buildings on campus open, because in fact, certain buildings such as this that have decent filtration actually could protect occupants and staff members and students and people, because in many cases they're much safer than people's homes. That's not the case for every building, but the problem is we don't measure particulates within buildings. So we're currently looking at how do you optimize things like energy efficiency, natural ventilation design techniques of buildings in ways that, okay, I don't want to save a few kilowatts here if all of a sudden I'm going to be exposing my occupants to public health costs, especially knowing that public health or health-related activities has huge energy intensity, huge carbon intensity, huge water intensity. So holistically looking at how we can better understand pollution, both outdoor, indoor, and best optimize that to reduce exposures for the community as a whole. So
there's no early reading on how bad it was?
It was pretty bad. So there was a CNN article talking about we had for a moment the highest pollution levels in the world. It's about the standard in Kolkata on average right now. So those kind of levels are actually very representative of India on a very regular basis, unfortunately. In Diwali holiday in Delhi, my networks are actually capturing 4 times the concentration of what we saw the worst in Berkeley. And if you can even start to imagine that, which it's challenging, I won't go to India during the winter months, it's really quite extreme. And when you put this in perspective, 1 in 2 children in Delhi will have a chronic lung condition for the rest of their life, which is a terrifying prospect.
I've been in Delhi in winter, and I can agree with that.
Exactly, yeah.
So maybe following up a little bit on that and taking sort of a systems architectural point of view, assuming that say the smart city paradigm works itself out, how do you see yourself participating in that? And just to nail it down to particular things, I noticed you have temp and humidity. I mean, how about precipitation, wind direction particularly, going indoors, indoor particulate, relating to the demographics of the area and of the home in that case, and the possibility of remote sensing.
Absolutely.
So maybe the question is, how can you participate in a smart city ecosystem as it develops over the next two to 4 decades?
Yeah.
In terms of a data interface and participate both ways.
So that's really where we actually look at ourselves below what we call the smart city aggregators, where we work with groups like Cisco or CTOS in France, where they typically have their Kinetics for Cities platforms, or whatever they call it today, which are these dashboards that are meant to bring all that data in. So we're actually in the process of taking our data through typically API. We pump it in there. And for instance, in Rouen, France, we're actually controlling traffic control signals in ways that could alleviate NO2 down certain corridors within the city. And to me, this is actually the most exciting value. It's how we start to cross the air quality data with other data sets, including, of course, air quality, which we do for the environmental models. But likewise, we are looking at other ways we can, of course, attach additional accessories through serial ports and future hardware generations. But of course, to me, that is the big value, because to me, for the policies, it's looking at the transportation data, it's combining that with the air quality data. You know, we've developed the insights that really drive the action from the data combined with other data. And I think that the air quality data alone is one piece of the puzzle, and our key is to provide that as accurately and as cost effectively as possible. I think in terms of all the other data sets, as I mentioned, that's part of the fun. We're now finding that particulates have an impact on ignition risks within the electrical utilities distribution and transmission infrastructure. Who'd have thought? Really fascinating. And that we're looking at predictive maintenance in wind turbines. We're looking at a whole bunch of these different user applications I didn't touch on. And for me, that's part of the fun right now, is that I'm finding applications I never would have dreamed of for the data that has impacts and crossed significant value throughout a number of different industries. So. Did I answer your question all right? Okay.
Thanks for your presentation. I had two questions. First, I appreciate you talking about the challenges of scaling business development in B2G environments. And I was intrigued that the value proposition and use cases were like very, very different across the cities you mentioned. Like Mexico City is a human-centered design application, whereas Cupertino is, you know, something much more functional. I'm curious if you could say a little bit more about how you manage, you know, very different value propositions across and scaling those up, what that looks like in your team, and especially maybe in the Kuala Lumpur example where it, you know, maybe ruins the dreams of a certain government official who wanted to, you know, run an electric bus program. And second, just like you mentioned with some of these applications that were unexpected, like the HVAC design, the wind turbine predictive modeling. I mean, what are you most excited about, and what do you like in terms of a new market for you guys? Thank you.
Two great questions. So starting with the first one on the B2G challenges and opportunities, the easiest way for us, each city, just like each person, is unique in that regard. And we want to understand what the unique situation is there. So that's part of where BD, as we joke, it's business development. I also call it bottle destruction, because we end up sitting down and drinking and having coffee with these people all around the world. And we just want to understand what is the unique challenges they're dealing with, and what would be the most effective use case for us in terms of how we could apply our technologies to solve their problems. So with San Mateo County, I'm actually setting up with SMC Labs, a network right now. I'll be finalizing that on Monday and then scaling out. Very often we just start with the spatial distribution of pollution. People don't realize how different the air quality is in Redwood City versus East Palo Alto versus West County out in Pescadero, for instance, where we just start and say, hey, look how different the data is. Once we have those networks in place, we can always use other examples of case studies from elsewhere in the world. And strategically right now, we're trying to develop demonstrations on these different use cases. And I'm always finding new ones right now. And that's kind of the fun, is that once I have those kind of serialized, I can point to those. In terms of your second question, the indoor-outdoor nexus is really exciting. The work we've been doing with CITRIS, looking both indoor and outdoor buildings, the ratio of indoor to outdoor air in buildings across campus is huge. Now, Berkeley is generally clean throughout most of the year, but you take campuses like Merced and Davis, it's a blind spot. We've been working on building energy efficiency. This building does tremendous Satarjadai Hall demand response cuts, 30% demand response. But 2 years ago, we actually had to manually override that HVAC system because of the particulate penetration. So how can we, again, optimize some of this building by building case? And rather than having a blanket campus closure, could we move classes to more clean buildings? Could we buy some mobile purifiers and optimize certain buildings? Like, there's a lot of opportunity there. So I'm very excited about kind of, I would say, that space. And then some of these other use cases like predictive maintenance for the utility infrastructure to stop forest fires that we find there's these interesting correlations with ignitions and particulates. Very cool, big use cases, very relevant to societal challenges. Happy to chat further though, yeah.
Thank you so much for the very thoughtful questions today. And please join me in thanking Sean for this very enlightening presentation.